Yeah, that's what I was out, but I have bold like that.
Right. I know. It does get better. Enough with the lights on, or would you prefer the lights off? Lights on. Lights off. Okay, we'll do that. So I want to welcome you to our fifth, I think, Haddin Forum for the year. It's wonderful to see so many people here. We've had a great turnout for the series this year. And so today we have a presentation from philosophy, and I've asked Ted Bendit to go ahead and introduce our speaker.
Thanks. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Marshall. Marshall's been at UAB for several years now, and last year he acquired the earned tenure today. And unlike most of us in philosophy, or at least speaking for myself, Marshall does a lot of interdisciplinary work, which puts him in context with people from a lot of other disciplines. Of course, in line with one of the directions that the college and the university are interested in going. Marshall's main area is kind of philosophy of science, which embraces philosophy of biology. He does philosophy of probability, philosophy of social sciences, a wide range of topics that he takes up. Although I myself know very little about the kind of modeling work that Marshall does, I do find it very interesting that insights that we can gain into something like the biological sciences by means of mathematical modeling can give us insights into cultural processes as well. And so I'm anxious to learn more about that. Marshall.
Okay. First, thank you for coming, and I want to thank Kim Schnormeyer and Rebecca Bach earlier for organizing this and inviting me in. There are going to be 4 parts of this talk. One of the analogy part is just some background sort of context setting. And then the focus is going to be an article whose title was "One Cultural Parent Makes No Culture." And then I'm going to talk about a kind of model in evolutionary biology that provides a possible explanation of why sexual reproduction evolved from asexual reproduction. And I'm going to suggest that a certain kind of Muller's Ratchet model helps us to understand the models in this One Cultural Parent article, which is about culture, obviously. And then I'm going to go on and talk about the concept of coherence in epistemology, philosophical epistemology, and argue that actually there's a version of the concept of coherence that can help us to understand something about the cultural evolution model discussed earlier also. I'm a philosopher of science, as Ted said, and some of the things that philosophers of science are interested in are understanding the logical structure of scientific arguments and how conclusions in science are justified by premises and various sorts of methods and techniques. We're also interested in elucidating assumptions and implications of scientific arguments. The scientists will do research and modeling and collect evidence and will make certain claims, but sometimes there are things about the world that you can say that are implicit in the way in which scientists are going about this that the scientists don't necessarily bring out because it's not part of their goal. And sometimes philosophers of science will look at the overall structure of the scientific practice and argue for sort of broader and deeper implications of what's going on. So in this talk, I'm going to be focusing on the structure of a certain class of arguments, certain group of arguments. I'm not sure whether to call it anthropology or not, because a lot of the kind of modeling work that I'm going to be talking about is done by people with degrees in anthropology or who are in anthropology departments, but some of them aren't. And I think the mainstream of anthropology doesn't necessarily think about this kind of modeling all that often. But I'm considering it anthropology. So let me just I want to talk a little bit about some relationships between some of the things that go on in the humanities. And I'm not going to try and characterize all of the humanities in a couple slides. That would be maybe entertaining. But I do think that there's some parallels between what people do in humanities in some cases, what people do in mathematics, and what people do in science that I think a lot of scholars aren't aware of. They don't see these relationships. So this is a quote from Hemingway talking about F. Scott Fitzgerald, and I don't know a lot about either of them, but it's a nice little quote. His talent was as natural as the pattern that was made by the dust on a butterfly's wings. One time he understood it, no more than the butterfly did, and he did not know when it was brushed or marred. Later he became conscious of his damaged wings and of their construction, and he learned to think it could not fly anymore because his love of flight was gone, and he could only remember when it had been effortless. So obviously, Hemingway is trying to talk about F. Scott Fitzgerald and his talent as a writer by analogy with certain facts about butterfly wings and butterfly flight. And what Hemingway is doing is saying that there are certain relationships between facts about butterflies. The fact that they are not aware of the color patterns on their wings, and yet they use these wings to fly. So these are relationships between properties of butterflies. And what Hemingway is saying is that there are analogous relationships between facts, various facts about Fitzgerald. So what Hemingway is doing is pointing out structural relationships between properties concerning butterflies and F. Scott Fitzgerald. Now, these are very loose, slippery structural relationships, and I think I'm not really doing justice to what happens in this paragraph by putting it that way. But nevertheless, I think that's part of what Hemingway is doing, and that's one sort of thing that happens in the humanities. When people talk about interpretation in the humanities, sometimes I think what they're talking about is pointing out abstract structural parallels in a loose sense between more than one thing. Now in mathematics, people do something like that. A lot of people think of mathematics as primarily about numbers, and it is, a lot of it is about numbers. So the last Haddin talk was by Carmelisa, I'm sorry, I forgot her last name. Well,
Nebraska.
say it again?
Nebraska.
Nebraska. Yeah, sorry. Had it in my notes. But she was talking about multiplying lots and lots of numbers, not multiplying and adding lots and lots of numbers all at once. And some of the methods she was talking about, obviously you can read about in textbooks. In some of those textbooks, I have a textbook on a very closely related subject to what Carmelisa was talking about, in which there's almost no talk of numbers until this one chapter in the middle where they say, oh, and by the way, this applies to numbers too. What there is instead is a set of rules or principles saying, suppose that we have things that follow X, Y, these 3 rules or these 5 rules. Now, given just knowing that they satisfy those rules, we can draw all these conclusions. Oh, and it turns out that that arrays of numbers satisfy these rules too, but maybe other things do also. So the mathematics is really about structural relationships. And you see this, for example, when in the mathematics of waves, one of the things that people do is they stop talking about waves and start talking about the square root of -1, numbers involving the square root of -1, which you can't see anywhere. You can't get, by -1 apples. You don't have a ruler that will tell you how long square root of -1 feet are. Sorry, with the square root of -1. But it turns out that there are structural parallels between mathematical facts involving the square root of -1 and waves. So you can find out a lot of things about waves by translating your wave questions into these questions involving the square root of -1, and then when you get done working out some things, you translate it back to waves. But there's nothing intrinsically about the square root of -1 and raising something to the power of the square root of -1 that tells you about waves. It just turns out there are these structural parallels. But there is this difference between this focus on analogies and structural parallels in the humanities and that in mathematics, which is that in in mathematics, usually the structural parallels, the analogies are very, very precise. It's mathematics. Now, in science, one of the things people do is mathematical modeling. And this is kind of like mathematics and kind of like the humanities. Because if you're doing mathematical modeling, obviously you've got this very precise mathematical formula at some point, or formulas. But you're using it to talk about something that doesn't match it precisely, that doesn't necessarily have exactly that structure. You're using this precise entity to talk about something that might be very messy and complex. And so that's the sort of thing I'm going to be talking about. So I don't know if you can see the titles at the top, but evolutionary biologists use mathematical models to study abstract patterns of change over time in populations of organisms. And you know, a population of organisms in the real world is something very messy. Every one of those organisms have cells and physiology and cognitive processes, and they're interacting with the rocks and trees and each other, and it's very messy. The mathematical models are not messy, but the relationship between the models and the real world is. Social scientists do this too, including some people studying culture. So you can use mathematical models to study what happens in a human society. But the human society is very messy and complex and so on. So obviously you're leaving out a lot of the detail. But the idea is that by using mathematical models, in some cases, you can capture you can get some insights about these sort of broad patterns that are happening in the population, in this society. And it's not, recently I was at a conference and an anthropologist asked me about my simulation research. Is it reductionistic? And I'm not sure what she meant, but I think what she means is, do I think that there's nothing more than what I can capture in my models when I talk about human society? No, I don't think that. I think I'm capturing something that applies in some cases somewhat. So, all right, so I'm going to be talking about cultural transmission. This is not how everybody uses the word culture. It's used in lots of ways. But I'm going to use the term social learning versus individual learning. So individual learning happens when you learn something on your own. You just figure it out, you do some investigation. Social learning happens when you learn something from someone else, maybe just by watching them, maybe even noticing what they do. But the assumption here that I'm going to make is that there are at least minor differences in beliefs, knowledge, behavior, attitudes, etc. between people within a society, within a culture. And that sometimes those differences influence people in such a way that they acquire the same thing from someone else. They were influenced to be like this other person. So this is like the concept of meme, but it's a much broader and looser concept than that. A meme has some connotations that I don't want to take on. So here's an illustration. Prehistoric Tasmanians only had very primitive technology when people had, I believe the story is that when Europeans first got to Tasmania, people, how did they fish? They grabbed fish out of the water. What kind of clothing did they have? They had skins that they would wrap around themselves. But just over, not too far away in Australia, which is where the Tasmanians originally came from, they had elaborate buttons that they could construct, that they had constructed on their clothing. They had spears, they had barbs on spears. They had all sorts of technology that the Tasmanians didn't have. And yet, these two groups of people came from the same origins. And the data makes it look like as if when the Tasmanians left Australia, there was already more advanced technology in Australia than was found later on in Tasmania. This is a puzzle. What happened to Tasmanian technology? And Joe Henrich is an anthropologist, and he did some models in which he showed that if you make certain somewhat plausible assumptions, that people try to imitate the best technology in their society, but they make mistakes. Sometimes they get it wrong, so sometimes the technology sort of goes backwards, but sometimes they may make mistakes that are good. That happens less often, that improve the technology. But if you model the transmission of technology the way that Henrik did, it turns out that if you have too few people in a society, the quality of the technology gradually degrades over time. If you have more people, or if you have trade between different groups, then the quality of the technology improves over time. So Henrik suggested that the reason that Tasmanian technology degraded over time was because there were too few people, and they couldn't get off the island to trade with anything else. So that's just an illustration of how a mathematical model that's very abstract might provide insights out into what happens in the real world. So I'm going to, there's the authors are Enquist, Strimling, Erickson, Leyland, and Sjöstrand. I'm going to call them Essels over and over again, so when you hear me say Essels, I mean the authors of this article. And they argue that if an element of culture, for example, behavior, is always and only acquired from a single person, a single cultural parent, and never from, say, 2 or 3 cultural parents, that's the way cultural transmission works. People only learn it in the first place from a single person, then what will happen over time is the culture will go away. There will be no culture. One cultural parent makes no culture. And by the way, it's not a comment about single parents. I grew up in a single parent household, but it's a cute term to call it single parent culture. So the assumption here is that a cultural variant, behavior, technology, a belief, is either present in a person or not. And you assume that learning isn't perfect. Sometimes someone tries to teach you something, or you try and imitate them, and you just don't get it. So Essels give these models that show that under these assumptions, it's very hard to maintain culture in a population. It will almost certainly go away. And here's a diagram illustrating this. I've tried to keep the real math out of here. There's a little bit of math on the slides later. You don't have to understand it. It's just pretty pictures. So the idea is we're moving from the top to the bottom, time-wise. The dashed lines mean someone tried to teach someone. Each circle is a person. Dashed lines means there was an attempt to teach or to learn, and it didn't work. And since the learning is imperfect, some of the teaching attempts or learning attempts are going to fail. And since everybody's learning from one person, you can't learn from a person who's gray, who has no culture. Only red people have culture. And since at each time you get some of the teachers who fail to communicate what they know, you get this gradual reduction in culture over time. And eventually culture goes extinct. And then there's some other, they work through a lot of different variations on these models. So in one model, you say, well, suppose that culture makes you fitter, the cultural variant. So let's say it's a spear technology or something. So it allows you to survive and reproduce longer. And if you're around longer, then you're around longer to teach more people. So maybe that will help maintain culture. And it turns out it helps. It does help maintain culture, but not enough. I mean, unless the fitness advantage of having the cultural variant is really incredible, like twice as much as everybody else, something like that, then it's not going to be able to maintain the cultural variant in the population. It will still disappear. One thing that does make it easy to maintain culture is if you get rid of the assumption that everybody only learns from one other person and allow them to learn from multiple people. And the idea is that you've got these people who I've placed on the right who fail to learn from the first person that teaches them. But that's okay because someone else teaches them. Someone else who has the cultural variant. And there's some details of this diagram that aren't really accurate to the Essel's model, but I think it conveys the idea. There's some other variants, like if instead you have someone try to learn multiple times from the same cultural parent, that helps a little, but it still makes it usually, under most situations, would lead to culture disappearing. You can also combine social learning from others, with individual learning on your own. And it turns out this can maintain the cultural variant, but usually only if you could have learned it on your own anyway pretty easily. Like if the individual learning could maintain that behavior or technology in the society by itself, that's pretty much what you need for the social learning to help it all. Without, the individual learning has to be so effective that you might as well not have the social learning. So, and these mathematical models work, given the assumptions. If the assumptions are correct, they really make sense. But to me, there's some puzzling things about this. So one is that there are lots of other mathematical models of cultural change that don't lead to culture disappearing. There's a whole, for example, there's a book by Cavalli Sforza and Feldman where there's several models where they're just tracing out under what conditions will culture spread or will culture change. Again, with very simple culture, just a few cultural variants that are transmitted from one person to another, and they don't lead to culture disappearing. So I was puzzled. What's different about this, the Essel's models? The other thing that puzzled me is that intuitively it seems like there are cases where people routinely learn things from a single person. How many people taught you long division? In my case, it was Mrs. Maltak. She taught me long division, and she probably learned it from one person too, and that person probably learned it from one person too. So how is it we're still able to do long division? Seems like the Essel's models implies that we can't. So to sum this all up, the Essel's models show that it's hard to maintain a cultural variant in a population if cultural transmission is always comes from a single cultural parents, but it's easy to maintain the variant in the population if it's usually transmitted by two or more cultural parents. But there are these puzzles. So I'm going to have the next two sections. The first section is going to deal with the first puzzle. The second section will deal with the other puzzle. And I better hurry up. So, why did sex evolve? Originally all organisms were asexual. Many still are, of course. In some species, there's both asexual and sexual reproduction. And one of the things to keep in mind is that an organism can't just produce as many offspring as possible. It takes a lot of energy to produce offspring, even if you're talking about just producing eggs. It's expensive to produce an egg. And here's the really puzzling thing about the existence of sexual reproduction. So suppose you've got asexual reproduction, and each organism can produce, for example, at most 2 offspring. So this individual produces 2 offspring, and then in the next generation, she's got 4 grandchildren. That's fine. All right. So now, if instead she's a sexual reproduction, so on average she's going to produce half males and half females, 1 of each in this case. And suppose it was just her, for example, producing the male and the female. Well, then in each one is going to produce 2 offspring. But between the 2 of them, they only produce 2 offspring. So instead of ending up with 4 grandchildren, the sexual reproducer ends up with 2 grandchildren. So obviously, natural selection is going to get rid of sexual reproduction. It's terribly inefficient, unless there's some incredible advantage to sexual reproduction. And this is this puzzle that evolutionary biologists have been working on for a few decades, actually. And there are lots of different explanations, possible explanations. There's lots of detailed work about, well, is it this? So, you know, in these contexts and that in those contexts. I'm just going to talk about one possible benefit of sexual reproduction. And this is called Muller's Ratchet. So this is a class of models in which when there's only asexual reproduction, what happens is that disadvantageous mutations gradually accumulate in a population, and eventually they accumulate so many of these mutations accumulate that the population goes extinct. So we're assuming in a Muller's Ratchet model, we assume reproduction is asexual, that very few mutations are beneficial. This is realistic. Most mutations are maladaptive, or as we say, deleterious. They reduce fitness. And we also assume that extremely deleterious mutations are quickly selected out of a population. So we're just going to ignore them as they go away very quickly. This is also pretty realistic. We also assume that once a mutation is present in the population, if it's not selected out, it just usually stays there. It's not going to be undone by another mutation. That's extremely improbable. So when one organism gets a mildly deleterious mutation, all of its descendants will have that same deleterious mutation. Eventually, one of its descendants is going to have another deleterious mutation. So now the descendants of that one have two deleterious mutations. So you get this gradual accumulation of mutations, bad mutations. Some lineages are going to have some, sequences of parents and offspring are going to have more than others. However, organisms can fail to reproduce just by chance. That's the normal population. Evolution is a chancy operation, whether there's natural selection or not. And since each mutation is only very slightly deleterious, we're not, just because I have one more deleterious mutation than you doesn't mean I'm going to be selected out of the population. What can happen is that eventually those organisms with the least mutations, the fewest mutations, just by chance, once in a while, they'll disappear from the population. And once that happens, all the members of the population have more deleterious mutations than before, because all the ones with the fewest mutations are gone. And we say that Muller's ratchet is clicked. You can never go back. You can never reduce that number of deleterious mutations. And that's okay, because they're only mildly deleterious, so what? But eventually the ratchet is going to click again. You're going to lose the fittest the class of organisms with the fewest mutations. And now all of the descendants in the population from then on have more mutations. And so this takes some time, but the idea is that eventually the population will go extinct because it keeps accumulating deleterious mutations. This is under the assumption that reproduction is asexual. And just as an aside, there's this thing in the news where people are talking about three-parent babies, where the idea is that there's some genetic defects that occur on mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is passed on only through women. And so if you've got a genetic defect in the mitochondria, it's not going to be balanced out or replaced by something from the father. So there's this proposal that maybe when we know about these genetic defects, we can replace the mitochondrial DNA with mitochondrial DNA from another woman. And it's actually, Muller's ratchet has actually been, it's been argued that it applies to mitochondrial DNA. There's been some investigation of whether this might be going on. You can get rid of this problem with sexual reproduction and recombination. So recombination is when you basically swap parts of chromosomes coming from the two parents. And the idea is that when you do that shuffling of chromosomes, you're going to have some offspring with fewer deleterious mutations than either of the parents. And so you restore the fittest class of the organisms with the fewest mutations to the population. So in Waxman and Lowe, in 2010, have a model of this, a sort of simplified model of Muller's ratchet called the truncated ratchet. They divide the population into two groups of organisms. those with the fewest mutations and those with more. So here you can glaze over your eyes if you want, but I just want to point out, what I'm showing you here, you'll take my word for it, is basically one of the last model I talked about, one of the models I talked about in Essel's is mathematically equivalent to a Waxman and Lowe's model if you match up the Essel's model concerning fitness of a cultural variant. You match up that part of the model, the parameter, with the Waxman and Lowe's parameter representing fitness of the fittest class versus the less fit class. And if you also match up the probability of error-free cultural transmission with Waxman and Lowe's probability of not having a deleterious mutation. And basically what I'm saying is that there's a structural parallel between these two models. It happens to be something you can spell out mathematically precisely. That there's I don't know if I want to say these are the same model, the Waxman and Lowe model and the Essel's model, but at some level of abstraction they are. So we can think of failing to learn from a single cultural parent as analogous to acquiring a deleterious mutation in an asexual species. And we can think of the benefit of learning from two cultural parents as similar to the benefit of getting genes from two biological parents. And the crucial thing about the Muller's Ratchet model is that there's always a chance of getting a deleterious mutation, and you can never go back. You can never undo that. And that's the crucial thing I realized about the Essel's models that differentiates them from many of the other models of cultural transmission, which is that in the Essel's model, you can lose culture, but you can never undo that. And that's what makes them like the Waxman and Lowe Muller's Ratchet model. And it wasn't until I saw this parallel that I realized what this sort of crucial assumption of the Essel's models was. So this is a summary of what I just said. So now I'm going to talk about coherence in epistemology. And I'm still worried about the fact that it seems like we only learn long division from one person. There are other things like that. I think it's not the long division problem. Someday one of your students is going to say, "Yeah, I learned X from Professor so and so," and not from anyone else. So let me switch gears. Now I'm going to talk about coherence in epistemology. So suppose we've got the defendant's been accused of murder. 3 different witnesses say these things. One says the defendant threatened the victim. The other says the defendant had been following the victim. I guess 4 different witnesses. The third says the victim cheated the defendant out of some money, so the defendant had a motive. And the fourth witness said the defendant owned a gun of the same caliber as the murder weapon. So there's a certain, intuitively it feels like there's a certain amount of coherence between these reports. And the fact that all these reports cohere seems to give them extra weight. If you took any one of these statements on its own, it's not enough to convict the person. But it seems as if the fact that they fit together adds extra evidence for the conclusion that the defendant was the murderer. So this is an idea that epistemologists have been talking about, partly to try and respond to arguments that, skeptical arguments that we don't know anything. Literally, we don't know anything. But I'm not going to focus on skepticism of that kind. But C.I. Lewis said, a set of statements or a set of supposed facts asserted will be said to be congruent. This is his term for coherent. Will be said to be congruent if and only if they're so related that the antecedent probability of any one of them will be increased if the remainder of the set can be assumed as given premises. Let me give you a simple illustration of this. Is that too fast? So consider the probability that the defendant threatened the victim. This is what one of the witnesses reported. and compare that to the report that the victim cheated the defendant, or one of the other witnesses reported. It seems as if, intuitively, the probability, the likelihood that the defendant did really threaten the victim, as the witness said, is greater, given that the victim cheated the defendant. So that is greater than if you didn't assume that the victim cheated the defendant. So what C.I. Lewis was trying to say is that we can capture this concept, this intuitive concept of coherence, in terms of probability relations, in terms of the fact that these four statements are related in such a way that if you assume some of them are true, that raises the probability of the other ones. And that's what he proposed was what our intuitions of coherence are about. And there's been a lot of work on this kind of idea in recent years, trying to spell this out formally, and this was started by a guy named Tomoji Shogenji. It turns out it's not clear that you can really characterize coherence. You can really, it's not clear that there's a way of specifying what coherence is in terms of probabilities that has the consequence that people have wanted, which is that when propositions are more coherent, they raise the probability that they're true. So it turns out it works some of the time, but not all the time. But I'm going to apply this in a different way, this idea of probability raising. So just think about, in real-world cultural transmission, that is learning. Usually we don't just learn isolated bits of information. We learn lots of stuff that's all related. And there's educational research, at least that suggests, at least in American school systems. I don't know about the jungles of Borneo or anywhere else, because we haven't done much of that kind of learning research. But it suggests that that we remember and can use what we learn more effectively if the things we learn are systematically related to each other. Maybe part of that is if the things we learn are related and mutually supporting in some sense. But in a sense, we just saw that coherence in epistemology might concern evidence and inference in such a way that it helps if different things we believe are related and mutually supporting in a sense of raising probability. So I want to suggest that if people in a culture, in a society, are learning multiple things, that the fact that they cohere together, the things they're learning, helps to facilitate cultural transmission. When I was first thinking about this, I thought, yeah, maybe you can learn two different things from the same person, and the fact that they cohere will get rid of the single cultural parent problem. And when I thought this through, it turns out, no, it doesn't help. I mean, it helps, but it doesn't get rid of the problem. And even if, suppose that you learn cultural variant A from one person and cultural variant B from another, forget about coherence relations. Still, they're both going to disappear. You can apply the Essel's arguments to either one of those separately. But now, if we add in this kind of coherence of the C.I. Lewis Shogenji kind, suppose, for example, you can infer belief B from belief A. Like, you already think that if A, then B, and you learn A, and you try to learn B, but it didn't work out, right? Well, but you already know if A, then B. So once you learn A, you say, oh, B, and you don't need the fact that it wasn't transmitted by someone is okay. So this if-then kind of thing, that's a very narrow kind of relationship between beliefs. So let's think in terms of probability of you coming to believe something. So suppose that if you believe A, that makes it more likely that you'll come to believe B, just from that fact that you believe A. So the probability of B given A is greater than the probability of B without that. So then if you learn A, you might come to believe B also. So basically the idea is that suppose that We've got two beliefs, two cultural variants, beliefs whatever they are. It could be behaviors, that doesn't matter. We've got these two cultural variants, and it turns out that the probability of coming to acquire one is greater if you have the other, and that goes in both directions. I talked about this. Oh, sorry, no, this is, okay. So suppose you learn A and B from two different cultural parents. If you don't have the coherence relations, you've just got two single cultural parent processes. But because you can infer sometimes one of the cultural variants from the other, it turns out that single parent learning of these two cultural variants in this situation works out to be something like a kind of multiple cultural parent learning. And I'm still working through the mathematics of this. I've made some progress. It's not that complicated, but I do things slowly. So in this diagram, basically the black lines, black arrows, that's cultural transmission of variant A. The blue-green lines, whatever color you perceive them to be, those are, they consider that to be transmission of cultural variant B. And the idea is that, and the red means you have cultural variant A, the gray means you don't. So whether you have cultural variant B isn't represented on the diagram. But the idea is that sometimes when you fail to learn cultural variant A, because you learned cultural variant B, you end up learning A anyways, indirectly, so to speak. And the idea is that this way you can maintain cultural variant A in the population, even though you only learn A from single parents. And maybe that's why we can learn long division from one teacher without it disappearing from the population. Because when you learn long division, there's all this other stuff that you've already learned that supports that that knowledge and helps you, like if you forget what the teacher said one day, sometimes you can work it out. And also maybe it's not really from, you didn't just learn it from one person because there's this book written by someone else also, but we'll ignore that. So maybe Mrs. Maltak isn't completely responsible for my knowledge of long division. So here's what we've done. So we talked about Essel's arguments based on mathematical models of cultural transmission, showing that it seems to be difficult to keep a cultural variant from disappearing from a population unless people learn from multiple cultural parents. And we talked about the conceptual and mathematical analogy between the Essel's cultural transmission models and Waxman and Lowe's truncated Muller's Ratchet model of genetic evolution, genetic transmission in an asexual population. And we talked about modeling coherence relations between cultural variants using ideas from probabilistic measures of coherence in epistemology. And I suggested that when things cohere in the sense that there are these, that one thing increases the probability of learning the other, that turns single cultural parent transmission into a variant of multiple cultural parent transmission. So just more generally, I think there are fruitful analogies between cultural transmission and biological transmission. That's not surprising because a lot of the cultural transmission models were directly inspired by biological models. But this idea of using models concerning the evolution of sex to talk about cultural transmission, that I think is new. And I think also the idea of using epistemological coherence to think about complex interactions between cultural variants within people, that's also new. And I think there are further connections like this. These are sort of interrelationships I'm just starting to explore. And that's it.
Marshall, I was thinking in this last part of the persistence of creationists within Western society when, after 1859, but more after the turn of the century, well enough to basically prove evolution was a biological fact. And so the cultural the single cultural parent of creationists would be their own self-contained, church-related communities, but the kids who are in the school are being exposed to multiple cultural parents because they're getting their science education in school. So, this is very vague, but could you maybe sort of address how that circumstance might be explained as a persistence of the creationists inside this larger society of biological facts?
Yeah, I think in either domain, the biological science domain and the certain types of religious tradition domain, not all religious traditions, but in either case, there are probably multiple cultural parents interacting. But I do think that there's that part of what goes on is that there's some sort of coherence and incoherence in a vague sense, some sort of tension between certain beliefs. So, if the religion provides you with lots of emotional resources, or everybody around you keeps telling you how important this is, and the text that's the core text of the religion says, the universe was created in 6 days and so on, 6 days and so on. It's not that you can't work out how that fits with evolutionary biology, but it's harder. And so I think some things pull and push on each other. And I do think this is an illustration of some sort of coherence relations. I don't know whether it would be appropriate to model this in terms of probabilities or whether that would be too simplistic. But
Well, I think you could model it in terms of probability, because if you think of it in a population genetic standpoint, it's whichever those competing ideas or cultures win out is kind of the probability that any one base pair is going to accumulate a mutation based on the environmental stress around it. So before they have a child and pass on that mutation, so if the mutation occurs before they have children, such that the idea of science education sticks, before they have children, that mutation is going to be passed on, and that culture of creationism will be lost. But if they are able to maintain and not become mutated before they have children, then that culture will be maintained.
There is this concept of the benefit of mutation, and if you think about HIV, right?
Yeah.
Here we have you get some HIV that has several mutations accumulated. It actually makes it more fit, so it can evade the drugs that are available. So here's a case of asexual reproduction where the gathering mutations actually helps the organism.
Right. Yeah, no, that's so the assumption of the Muller's Ratchet models were that it wasn't that beneficial mutations never happen, but they happen so rarely that for the length of time we're focusing on, we can ignore them.
So there is a rate that's involved, and when you talk about viruses, especially something like HIV, it reproduces pretty rapidly.
Yeah, that's right.
And so you have DNA transcription going on, and DNA makes a lot of mistakes.
Right.
And then you have a filter in there, which is basically the fitness, the ability of the protein to get out of the cell and into the bloodstream.
Yeah.
Okay, that you basically select away
Right.
mutations that don't work, and you end up with that little bit that does.
Yeah, so part of that might be just, as you're saying, that viruses are reproducing so fast that it doesn't matter if most of them, most of the lineages die off. I'm not sure whether this is true of viruses, but in bacteria, which also reproduce asexually, we say, actually a lot of biologists will talk about bacterial sex, and they don't obviously mean sex the way we mean it.
Right.
But what they mean is exchange of DNA, and that does happen in bacteria. And there are arguments that the reason it happens is to deal with some of the problems that sexual reproduction in higher organisms is supposed to deal with. So I It would surprise me if there's viral sex, but I don't know.
Well, you probably think of in terms of, rates at which organisms turn over and that
Yeah.
sort of thing. If you talk about, okay, you got a virus, a very simple organism, it uses asexual reproduction. Then you start getting up to bacteria, and you see they kind of take the next step where they go ahead and they start, they're producing exosomes and it's shuttling back and forth DNA between them. You've got, So, as you move up the evolutionary scale,
Right.
as lifespans get longer, you need sexual reproduction.
Yeah, right.
Makes it fun.
Right, I mean also, and then there are RNA viruses that use RNA, which is a very error-prone transmission system. I don't know, I have to think about this stuff
Yeah.
more. You had a,
Yeah, so I'm in the health behavior department over in the School of Public Health. And obviously we're interested in getting people to change their behavior from, stop smoking or
Right,
start
right.
exercising more or something like that. What kind of, I guess, what kind of implications of what you're talking about do you apply to that so that we could, get more people to successfully adopt healthy behaviors?
right, so my first answer would be, gosh, I don't know, I'm just a philosopher of science. But my second answer, but since I've gotten that out of the way, now I can say anything I want. Right? And so I guess I would say, well, I think that different parts of a person, different sort of cognitive aspects of a person's life and of people around them can push in one direction or cohere or not. And so, maybe if you want to teach someone to do one thing, if you can teach them other things that will cohere with those, that might help. And also having more people telling them it, obviously that helps too. Those are the things I think of. And then those sort of interrelationships between different aspects of a person or what they think about could be very obvious and concrete. But they could be very subtle. Scott was talking about the relationship between creationism and evolutionary theory, and I think sometimes they, clash in a very direct way. But some of the things involved are very subtle, like people liking to hang out in their church with the people there. That provides you with some resources. The people there keep saying evolutionary theory is wrong. That makes it hard. But that's a subtle thing. It has to do with emotional needs for community. Yeah.
This is an observation that actually relates to the question that was raised to bring it back to the world of education. Coherence was probably one of the defining characteristics of John Dewey's philosophy of education as well, among a few others.
And so he used that term?
I don't know if he used the term coherence, but his philosophy, which has been characterized as sort of vocational education or Montessori education, which it wasn't, was that facts had to relate to the context of the child. They had to have coherence in that children's life.
Okay, good. I'm going to look at Dewey then. Ted.
You talked a good deal about mutations,
Yeah.
and a person experiencing life does not realize the mutation until maybe too late, later.
You're talking about biological mutations.
Biological mutations. But at the point where the mutation begins to occur, that is the point where somewhere in the brain we need to investigate, because the human experiencing this does not know it. But we need to do more research about the way that mutations actually occur with respect to behavior and conduct. See, so
In order to respond
Yeah.
to the situation?
That's right, to respond to the situation. If that can be done, that would be a beginning. But what about the person who thinks that he should dun the Congress for money to have a war? See,
Oh,
what-
because of a mutation in their
Yeah,
cognitive
see,
processes.
See, there's something there that has to do with behavior, and somebody will say, well, that's not a negative mutation, that's just a cultural accumulation
Right.
about war.
Um,
But, so you really raised some very difficult question, but I think it's one that really needs attention.
I mean, well, I think some of what's involved here is just the same things involved in learning and persuasion and culture in general. There are people who have argued that there's been some research suggesting that certain, such and such genes, on average, bias people to have certain psychological characteristics, and that these psychological characteristics interact with our culture to sort of make it more likely to become a Democrat or Republican or something like that. I think some of the ways that people have talked about it are not subtle enough, and certainly less subtle than what I just said, a little more subtle in other ways. I don't know, I'm a little worried that, I don't want to go down a road where we say, oh, well, you've got the C27X gene. Of course you're a warmonger. You don't have a right to be a warmonger. We're going to do some genetic manipulation, and then you'll be right.
Well, I suppose it's, in part, this is a job for physicians and pharmaceutical companies to find out what sort of medications can alter the path of a negative.
Right, but I think we have to give the person a choice as to whether they want to take the anti-warmongering drug.
There's a slide fairly near the end when you were summarizing the presentation where you likened descendants to students. Yes. Oh, you just, okay. So once a person loses a cultural variant, it can never come back among their descendants.
Right.
So if I lost this cultural variant, I couldn't transmit it to my
That's
student.
right.
Okay, so I misread that.
Yeah, but that's okay because, if he had
But
it.
somebody else can.
Yeah,
That was
that's
the
right.
point I wanted to
Yeah.
make. But it's not all on me. Somebody else can.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have a single parent transmission culture in general, but it seemed as if in some cases it does work like that, and that was puzzling. But I think part of what I'm suggesting is even in the cases where it seemed like there was single parent transmission, that was wrong because of these coherence
Right.
relations.
I can't myself think of a single instance of that. I was hoping you could provide an example because I immediately had trouble with your long division example because I just felt like you can't do long division without simple division or multiplication or
Well,
addition
that's
or
the point.
subtraction.
That's
so
the point.
She didn't give you those things. She put them together for you.
That's right. That's right, and you learn those things from other people.
And then there's the book.
Yeah.
That's right. I mean,
That you have to put away.
so there's this other example which is learning to ride a bicycle. And that seems like something you do learn from most people learn from one person. And I don't have, but my little story here has nothing to say about it, so I didn't mention it.
I like how you left out any kind of notion of improvement or progress as you're modeling, culture and adaptation. I mean, speaking as an anthropologist, a lot of the models, tend to talk about technology getting better and things like that. And going back to what we have a coexistence of ideas about evolution and creationism, and maybe in the room we side on one side of that argument, but those things coexist and are equally valid to people who believe either or. So I mean, I wonder, and these seem like very general models, and that's very interesting and wide predictive power maybe. And thinking back to was it Levin's talking about models are general, precise, or realistic. I mean, is that the goal to be very general? And how might we is sort of getting in there and explaining why cultures allow creationist belief, or why creationist belief exists alongside evolutionary belief? That's a complex kind of question why that might be. I mean, is there a goal ever to kind of get into the nitty-gritty of what's happening in these cultural systems?
I view studying humans, in social sciences, for example, but not only in social sciences, as something where I don't think there's going to be a systematic framework that even within some slice of questions. I think instead as far as modeling goes, I think you just need different models, and in each case you've got to interpret them and say, here are my assumptions, here's what I'm leaving out, or you probably can't say all that because there's too much you're leaving out, but here's how it might apply to a real population. And then you might move on to another model with a different set of assumptions, and each is going to give you different windows into this complex phenomenon. And then in addition, there are going to be other sorts of studies, ethnographies and so on, and literary studies, and things where you're not using mathematical models, you're not maybe counting numbers of people with X. I mean, I like counting, I like statistics, but I think there are processes that are so complex and so subtle that we can't get any insight into them if we just stick to the scientific methods. I'm not saying it wouldn't be nice, but and if we can, one of the things I'm interested in is, let me back up. So Steven Pinker had this article recently that a lot of people read, where he said, humanities should use more scientific methods, and I'm in favor of that. But the thing that he didn't emphasize, he said that, and then he also said, but some humanities should not use scientific methods. That was sort of in one paragraph. And I want to emphasize that second point. And I also think that scientific research should pay more attention to humanistic methods. I don't mean that in the humanistic anthropology sense, which is something very specific, but because the scientific methods are leaving out things, and you need to at least have some feel for what you're leaving out. And if there are ways to bring insights from humanistic research into scientific research in ways that it hasn't, I think that's worthwhile. And that's actually something that I'm trying to do with another research project.
And it's a huge, in anthropology's enormous polarization,
Yeah.
Cultural anthropologists wouldn't have, left and thrown something at you as they were leaving.
Yeah, I know. I know. I've been to a couple AAA meetings, and it's interesting. A friend of mine who's an anthropologist comes to some of my meetings and says, yeah, I'm just here doing ethnography, trying to figure out what people are saying. And that's sort of what I do at AAA meetings.
I think we probably should.
Okay. Thanks.